needed. You don't have an exact budget for what it might cost, but you're pretty sure that it's very modest compared to the potential harm. And then, you go on to quote the $3 trillion potential harm estimate from the World Bank. We're now in that global flu pandemic. Who knows how much it's going to cost? Do you think we will now see serious action towards building this global health system of the type you outlined?
Well, let's break down to pieces. Certainly the cost of this pandemic is greater than $3 trillion. It's way above that. So even though I was shy of saying such a big number when I gave the 2015 speech, in fact, we're well beyond that. The investments really come in two categories. One are the tools and the platforms to be able to make tools very quickly. The cost of that is tens of billions, so it's very small compared to what's at risk economically. So yes, I think both in the case of this pandemic and getting ready for future pandemics, the sort of research tool platform work, that will get funded. The second piece, though, which is the strength of the health systems in developing countries, that helps with both the normal disease burden, which is very, very large, and helps when a new epidemic comes along. That I can't say for sure, because then, it's a much larger price tag. And in that case, it's aid-type money, which is coming from rich countries to developing countries. And, sometimes it's spent effectively, sometimes it's not. And in the face of the economic difficulties that, most of the rich countries are having, I don't know whether this will spur their generosity for health system budgets in developing countries. I hope so. It would be just and, would help us catch the next epidemic early on, because, it's as likely to come out of Africa as Asia in the future, and, seeing it sooner makes a big difference. But I think that, unlike the tools investments, I think getting those health system investments will be a challenge. It's, I'm an advocate for foreign aid all the time, and it's often not an easy sale, and when countries turn inward, it gets even tougher.
Have you tried to persuade the US government to relent on its suspension of funding for the WHO? And what kind of reinvention of the WHO may fluidify that conversation?
Well, the WHO, actually has a fairly modest budget, and they are playing a crucial role in this pandemic. Like, many of the governments, I'm sure when we go back and do the retrospective, it'll be easy to say they should have done this sooner or this differently. But I think they are playing their sort of neutral role. And if anything, they need more resources to step up to that. So I'm hopeful that, the U.S. criticism won't actually result in less dollars going to WHO, because we need them now more than ever. And, they're stepping up and being very helpful. Even the question of, okay, which vaccine is the best one, which therapeutics are the best one, how do we get those allocated in the right way? The WHO definitely is the place where all the countries of the world come together to discuss health challenges. And so they're just super important. Some people think WHO is funded to make new drugs for vaccines, and it's not at all. It's actually got a pretty modest staffing level. Its budget isn't 1,000th of what is spent on healthcare in the United States. So, sometimes people expect it has capabilities beyond what it's actually funded to do.
I like the way you start this communique you put out today. You say it's like a world war, only we're all on the same side. Nationalist forces worldwide, I'd say, are testing that sentiment. But nevertheless, there have been some interesting moves towards, more international cooperation. In Africa, you have institutions like the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, who are amphibian in nature, half state, half agency corporation, giving them, flexibility and heft. Your own foundation works between the public and private sectors. Now, we obviously have a global challenge in health. We have a global challenge in the climate crisis. We don't particularly want a big global government. So what kind of global institutional architecture is going to get these big global challenges fixed?
Well, after World War II, there was a huge investment made in global institutions. Not institutions that actually could control things, but at least created a forum for cooperation. And, you have to say it's very impressive that since World War II, there hasn't been a nuclear weapon used, and the major powers have not gone to war with each other. And so the institutions were really designed to stop there being a World War III. They took on some other challenges, including that's when the World Health Organization got built. During the times where the U.S. viewed its global role as a priority and was viewed as not being selfish about that role, that helped a lot. And, in this particular crisis, there is a bit of a vacuum of leadership because the U.S. is primarily focused on the U.S. situation. And so some European leaders, and there's, great European leaders, are looking at how this collaboration can come together. So I've been speaking with, Macron, Merkel, Ramaphosa, various people about how we get this cooperation. This is an acute crisis. The climate is kind of the opposite, where the pain is way in the future, and yet you have to make changes now. So we need global institutions for, pandemics, bioterrorism, war, climate change, criminal activities. And I hope we come out of this understanding that we need to strengthen those and not, just have a nationalistic view, because these are problems that, even the richest country can't solve on its own. The United States will take a vaccine, if it comes from the UK or Germany or China, or, maybe it will come from the US, but, we want all the brilliant minds together to help us get the very best date for, for high impact treatments and to start to get the vaccine out so we can go back to normal at some point.
Are there any broad themes emerging in the data from the continent that might confirm or deny hypotheses around perhaps the lack of old people on the continent, meaning Africa is less vulnerable, or perhaps Africa is more vulnerable because of the greater number of underlying conditions such as HIV or malnutrition?
Over the next few months, we need to do surveillance to see what the true status is. Is it out there in big numbers, but people are reluctant to come in for testing, or is it just so hard to access the testing? I think in Nigeria, when the chief of staff not only got infected, but died from it, that, was kind of a wake-up call that, wow, this is really, must be out in the country, and is a very serious issue. I mean, that was tragic, like the UK with the Prime Minister getting it. Anybody who wasn't serious about it, that reminded them that this is pretty profound. There may be factors that help Africa that reduce the spread. Africa is a mix of Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. As yet, we haven't seen a big difference that, the force of infection is higher in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere. But that's one of the things that scientists really have to get on top of. I wrote a pretty extensive memo that lays out some of these open questions, and they'll be helpful, to determine what the right trade-off is for when and how we lock down versus, when we let the economy continue to go on. And so, policymakers are having to make decisions with very limited data right now, particularly when it comes to the epidemic in Africa.
Final question, if I may. There are lots of people looking for silver linings at the moment, or resets in how we see globalization, markets, the role of government. I even read a line in your communique about how governments will need to regulate when wealthy commercial operators like cruise ship operators might be allowed to purchase testing machines ahead of public health operators. Something like that a few months ago would have been decried as some kind of impossible socialism. Now it just seems like common sense.
Well, health outbreaks do make us dependent on the government. And, we'll all look at how did our government do? Because anticipating big problems like this, we expect the government to have the experts and to make those long-term investments. And so it's a bit disappointing. Certainly on the testing side, just letting the, who can pay for it get access has meant that the visibility from testing, has been way less than it should be. So yes, we're asking governments to step up, and, governments are being asked to do things that they've never done before. And, we're being asked to trust government, when we're being told to change our behavior. And, so I hope that understanding that governments aren't just about policies, they're about deep expertise and competence. I hope that is one of the lessons people take away from this.
That's all for this week. Our thanks to Bill Gates for taking part. You can find out more about what the Foundation is doing at gatesfoundation.org. Head to theafricareport.com for the daily briefing on how to live with COVID, and come say hi at Nick Norbrook and at The Africa Report on Twitter and on our Facebook page too. Don't worry, if you don't run a $1 billion foundation, you can be of assistance too. If you enjoyed listening, why not help others to find this podcast by giving us 5-star reviews and saying lots of nice things? We're counting on you. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.